Wow, well, what a night we have here. Welcome to everyone. And thank you, Marilyn and Lauren, and of course, David Vondrele. We are so grateful for your leadership to create this whole evening on this 25th anniversary event. Thank you so much. And I want to thank each and every one of you for being here and for your annual support of Wild About Harry. This is our nation's premier dinner honoring America's 33rd President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief. And this moment is special. This brings us to a moment in tonight's program that is very important, I think, to everyone here, and that is the presentation of the 2024 Harry S. Truman Legacy of Leadership Award. The Truman Library Institute created the award in 2010 to recognize individuals with a sustained and distinguished record of serving our nation and its democratic ideals. 15 years later, Wild About Harry audiences have been privileged to hear from some of our nation's most distinguished public servants. And tonight, that tradition continues. Harry Truman, as we know, had a lot to say about politics. He also had a lot to say about public service and leadership. All good advice that hopefully we can all take to heart in this election year. Some of the things he's known for saying are things like, know your history, listen hard, don't sit on the fence, forget the polls, and share the credit. And then there's a quote that Harry coined in 1942 that you probably hear all the time and may not have known it was Harry's, but it is, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Our 2024 honoree is someone who has proven that he can take the heat, and sometimes he can give the heat when it's necessary. U.S. Senator Roy Blunt. Yes. In addition to the heat of politics, though, Senator Blunt has added much-needed light as well. Although they served on different sides of the aisle, Roy Blunt and Harry Truman have more than a few things in common. Both were Missouri farmers. Senator Blunt was born a couple of hours from here on a dairy farm in Niangua, about 100 miles from Harry's birthplace in Lamar, Missouri. Both served as county clerks. Both were students of history, and both knew how to reach across the aisle for the common good. Senator Blunt's career includes representing the state of Missouri for 12 years in the U.S. Senate and 14 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. Among his many achievements, Senator Blunt is one of only 2 Americans in all of congressional history to be elected to leadership positions by his colleagues in both the House and the Senate. As chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health and Human Services and Education, Senator Blunt prioritized federal funding and resources while also raising awareness on critical issues, like increased investment in medical research. Among so many other accomplishments, Senator Blunt has been recognized by numerous health research advocates for his bipartisan leadership during the COVID crisis and in the areas of Alzheimer's disease and mental health. In an era of political gridlock that would probably stun even Harry Truman, Roy Blunt was universally regarded by his colleagues as that rare legislator who got things accomplished in Washington, D.C. He was deeply respected for having achieved many, many results in a bipartisan way. More than many, many people realize, Senator Blunt was someone who always reached across the aisle and has a string of accomplishments of bipartisan legislation. He worked in areas bipartisan, like infrastructure, like national security, and so many more. When he announced that he would not run for a 3rd term, Senator Blunt said he's more of a next chapter guy than a last chapter guy. And true to form, Senator Blunt's public service has continued in earnest. He is the chair of the Leadership Strategies Advisory Services Group at Husch Blackwell Strategies, and among other positions he holds, Senator Blunt is an executive fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He's the chair of the advisory board of the National Geospatial Agency of the U.S. government, and he's a member of the Commission on Presidential Debates. We will hear from our honoree in just a few moments, but first, to help present tonight's award, I would like to invite President Truman's grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel, to join me on stage.
Good job. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you. Let me look at my script here. Of course, I lost where I'm supposed to be. It's always great to be at this event. It's always good to see all of you. And I'll say first and foremost that on behalf of the Truman family, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you to all the organizers, to the staff of the library and the Institute for putting all of this together every year. It's a fantastic event. And I'll just add one more note to Madeline's excellent introduction of our honoree. Senator Blunt's one of the best friends that my grandfather's presidential library has ever had. Like Grandpa, his public service has always been grounded in a deep understanding of history and a commitment to bipartisanship. He's a champion of education and has been a tremendous supporter of our civics programs, my grandfather's Classroom for Democracy. And they didn't give me a lot to do tonight, so I thought I would throw in a story or two, and I made a critical error in running them by Kim Rausch first, so I'm down to one. And I'll start off by saying, years ago, my grandmother ran into a hostess in Washington while they were in the White House. And the hostess said to my grandmother, "Mrs. Truman, can't you get the president to stop using the word manure?" And my grandmother looked at her and said, "You obviously don't know how long it's taken me to get him to use the word manure." Now, Ronald Reagan took that and ran with it. He told a story, and this is in honor of the Republican side of our room this evening, Senator Blunt and the Republican side. Ronald Reagan told the story of a candidate who went out into a Democratic farm company and asked if he could give his stump speech, and the farmers said, "Sure." He said, "Do you have anything I can stand on?" And they said, "Well, the only thing over there is that pile of what Harry Truman eventually came to call manure." And then I said, "Well, if there's nothing else, I'll do it." So he got up and he gave his speech, and he came down afterwards and he asked the farmers, "What did you think of it?" And the farmers said, "Well, that's kind of nice. That's the first time we've heard a Republican speech." And the candidate said, "Well, that's all right. That's the first time I've given a Republican speech from a Democratic platform." That said, now that Kim will kill me later, it is truly a pleasure and a privilege to recognize Senator Blunt's lifetime of service to this community, to this state, and to this nation. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our 2024 Harry S. Truman Legacy of Leadership honoree, Senator Roy Blunt. Bringing up David? Yes. Tonight, rather than make acceptance remarks, you're in for a bit of a treat. We have an exclusive conversation with Senator Blunt, led by our good friend and Washington Post columnist, David Von Drehle. So please join me in welcoming David to the stage.
Senator Blunt, Roy, congratulations. It's a pleasure for us to be able to honor you tonight. I'd like to start by moving this down. I want to reflect on you just a little bit. It's been one of the pleasures of serving on the board of the Truman Library Institute has been the chance to get to know you. I want to say two things about you. The first, I know a little bit about Washington, not nearly as much as you do, not as much as our keynote speaker tonight, Evan Thomas, but a little bit. And the thing I know about being elected by your peers to serve in leadership is people trust you. Doesn't always mean people like you. Can mean they fear you, but number one, it means they trust you because you have to be able to carry their messages into the leadership and to deliver their views straight and to deal with them honestly, or the system doesn't work, as unfortunately we see from time to time. The fact that you would be one of only 2 people in the history of the United States elected to the leadership, both of the House and the Senate, is an extraordinary achievement. And I want to underline that. The second thing specifically for this audience that cares about the President Truman's Library and Museum so much, there is no person living and probably no person dead except for the President himself who has done as much for this institution as you've done. Just to name a few things, there is now a statue of Harry Truman, not just in the Capitol, but in the Capitol Rotunda, because you used your influence as Rules Committee Chairman to make sure that that statue was placed where he belonged. And if you think that's easy, let me tell you who had to be moved out of the Rotunda to get him there. A fellow named Broadway star, Alexander Hamilton.
Chuck Schumer still has not forgiven me for that. So.
You created a relationship, fostered a relationship between the library and the state of Missouri that we'd never had before. And you've supported that, and to date, the state has supported our capital campaign and continues to support our mission to the tune of millions of dollars every year. That I ascribe to you. You made a connection with us, with the Boeing Corporation, to become a major sponsor of the museum renewal and the lead sponsor of our 75th anniversary Civil Rights Symposium last year in Washington. And finally, the gift just keeps on giving. We're in the process of a almost $12 million beautification of the grounds so that the library will be as educational and as inspiring outside as it is inside, thanks to your legislation that you got through this Congress that famously can't get anything done. So I thank you and salute you. The library will never forget you. I know it's been important to you in the Senate that you succeeded Harry Truman. Talk a little bit about that, because it was a very personal relationship for you.
Well, it was. Let me first mention the library. When I was elected Secretary of State 40 years ago, the State Archives is in the Secretary of State's office, and I put together an archives advisory panel. And one of the people I was lucky enough to get to serve on that was Ben Zobrist, who was running the library at the time. And I remember going to the library. I think I'd been there one time before, but I'd never been the time I went after that with Dr. Zobrist. And I said, I want to see everything. And so suddenly I'm back in the shelves of all the things that occasionally get out and some that never get out, the true inside picture of sort of the Truman presidency and the Truman family, and I loved that. And then when I got to the Senate, you know, in the Senate, everything is done on the basis of seniority, everything. Selecting offices starts to be the first big thing done on the basis of seniority, and I got a call one day from Dan Coates, who was the only person in our freshman class that was more senior than me because he'd been in the Senate before. Been in the Senate, retired from the Senate. came back in 2010 when I went from the House to the Senate, and I was the most senior House member, so I think he was 88 in seniority and I was 89, but all the people above us probably kept the offices they'd had, and we get to look at the offices that are vacant. Kit Bond had taken 12 years to get the Truman office and was so proud to have that office, but I was replacing Kit, so he was leaving. And Dan Coates calls me and says, I'm standing, he gets to choose before me, said, I'm standing in front of an office here, and there's a plaque on the door that says this was President Harry Truman's office when he was in the Senate. And he said, you choose after me, don't you? And I said, yes, I do. In fact, I choose tomorrow. And he said, if I don't take this office, will you take it? And I said, I'd absolutely take it. And if I take it, I'll never move to another office all the time I'm in the Senate. And he said, I think if there was a guy from Indiana like Harry Truman, an Indiana person should have that office. And so I'm going to look around and I'm not going to take this office today. And there aren't that many selfless stories told in the Senate, I will tell you that. And so Dan Coates went to an office that was divided on opposite sides of the hall that wasn't, in my view, even without the history of the office, nearly as good as the Truman office. But he let me have that office because of his sense of how important Harry Truman would be to the country and also to our state. And I was there for the next 12 years. And such a great gift to me and actually to not just every Missourian that came, but everybody that came to our office was interested in Harry Truman. And so I got to tell lots of stories about Harry Truman. And like Clifton said earlier, they might not stand up as well here with a room full of Truman experts, but they stood up pretty well there. And really, David, I felt like I'd lived with Harry Truman for 12 years. And I was a better person and a better public official because of it. And he had had 2 different blocks of 3 offices in the Russell Senate office building, and both of them happened to be in the 10 or so rooms that I had. And so, whether it was the stories of the Truman Committee, they had a room right off his, he only had 4 rooms. One was his office, and right next to it, they sort of ran the Truman Committee during World War II out of that committee. And for whatever reason, they always referred to that room as the doghouse. And there were pictures of he and the other members of the Truman Committee, Democrats and Republicans, not only in running the committee looking at the money that was being spent in World War II, but also being able to work together at a critical time in the history. And it was a great gift for me to be able to talk to people who visited our office. We turned his actual office that he used the last 8 years he was in the Senate into our conference room, called it the Truman Room, had a picture in that room of President Truman standing right in front of that window. So, I'd say this is President Truman's desk, and if you're standing in front of this window, you're standing right where he was in that picture. And then I had a story I love to tell where Truman supposedly, and this is contradicted by some facts and not by others, supposedly Truman came back to that office the first day he was president. And it was outside the office in the Russell hallway where he met reporters the first time. There had been photographers there the night before, but in his first meeting with the reporters, as I told the story, in the hallway right outside our office, he said, boys, and they were all boys then, he said, boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. And then he said, I don't know if any of you ever had a load of hay fall on you, so there's the Missouri farmer right there. But he said, last night I felt like I had the moon and the stars fall on me. And then he walked in the office there apparently to clean out his desk. And so I'd usually say, and what that really makes me wonder about was what was in his desk. It did mean that my desk was totally clean every day when I left.
Yeah, if that's your top priority, to get the desk cleared out, it raises some good questions for the next Truman biographer. Surely that relationship is strengthened by, as it was said in the introduction, you have so much in common with President Truman place, farm background. What is it? I always think of him as the man from Missouri. I wonder if you embrace that, and if so, what are the qualities of a leader from Missouri?
Well, I think Missouri's uniquely where the country comes together. The population center of the country has been in our state since about 1950 or so, kind of moving southwest down I-44. Sometimes you look at St. Louis and think this is the furthest west eastern city. Kansas City, much different, much more of a western city, oriented in a different way. It has a different feel. Southwest Missouri, where I'm from, is really more like Oklahoma or northwest Arkansas. The top of our state is basically like Iowa. The transportation modes of America come together right here. I think there's a sense in our state that doesn't exist in quite the same way anywhere else of what America's all about. And you can go from the Boot Heel, which is very Delta South, to northwest Missouri, which is further away than 3 state capitals from the Boot Heel, and get a sense. And Harry Truman, liked to be in a car. He liked to drive. He spent a lot of time all over our state, and I was lucky enough to do that as well. I do think being a county official matters. If you have a courthouse in Missouri today, or probably anywhere else in America, full of elected officials, and you go in that courthouse with a problem, every one of them wants you to feel like they did everything they could to help you solve your problem, whether it was solvable or not. And usually there's some solution, and I think, President Truman was a solution-oriented person, clearly an infrastructure person, which maybe go back to that hub of the country that occurs right here, and the road building things that he took so much pride in, keeping them both honest and efficient and effective. And I think it does matter being from here. And we've had a number of outstanding people serve in Congress from our state, and I think Missouri has an impact on you that may not occur, certainly wouldn't occur exactly the same way anywhere else, but I think it occurs in a substantially more national way here than it's likely to in other places.
One of the challenges for the Truman Library Institute, the Library and Museum, our partners, is that President Truman is now 75 years away. And our principal mission that he set for us was to be a classroom for democracy, very much an educational mission. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how this person from so far back in time continues to be relevant today.
I think that's a significant point too, David. Actually, when Truman became president, it's close to Lincoln's assassination as we are today to his first day as president. So, we've a lot of history changes here, but Harry Truman really defined the current world in ways that others didn't. One of Evan Thomas's books, one of my favorites, is Ike's Bluff. So you've got these two guys from just really a short distance apart between the two Harvard guys from the East Coast that really were probably president in the 16 most challenging years, short 82 days, the 16 most challenging years the country ever faced. And they did it so well. And when you look at the paper today, Israel, I may come back to that. I want to talk about Marshall and Israel a little bit. Israel, NATO, all of the discussions about world trade and world relationships, that's all Harry Truman. And then, his successor, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO at President Truman's request. But what a challenging time, and particularly coming out of the war where the country was all totally focused on the war effort. And how do you move from there to continued prosperity, which happens almost never, and in our country happened pretty well managed by this guy from Missouri and a great American and a great president, Harry Truman.
So talk about Marshall and Israel.
Well, you know, in Israel, I think Truman had such high respect for Marshall.
This is George Marshall.
This
Chief
is
of
George
Staff
Marshall, the
of
Marshall
Army.
Plan,
Yep.
which was really the Truman Plan, but Truman thought it'd be too political if you called it the Truman Plan. And so let's call it the Marshall Plan, the chief of staff, the top soldier in World War II, the guy who recruited Bradley and Eisenhower and everybody else. And he's Truman's Secretary of State and very opposed to recognizing Israel. And he says to Truman, right before Truman makes that final decision, maybe a day before, but in the days before he makes that final decision, Marshall says to Truman, well, if you do this, and if I would vote in the next election, and by the way, Marshall never voted in any election. He was from a era of military people that wanted to not be political at all, and he didn't vote in the next election, even though he was the Secretary of State. He said, if you do this, and if I voted in the next election, I would not vote for you. There's probably no person alive that could have said that and had more impact on Harry Truman, but he still went forward and did what he thought was the right thing to do, and did it within just a few minutes of the declaration that Israel was in existence as a country. That shows a lot of courage and a lot of commitment and a determination to do what you've decided is the right thing.
And David, yeah. In David McCullough's great biography of President Truman, he has the bookend scene, which is a little luncheon gathering, I think at Army-Navy Club, of key members of the Truman administration as President Truman is about to leave the office. And they have, Clark Clifford and so on, and they're all gassing on about Truman. And Marshall's sitting there very obviously quiet. And at the end, this is when Truman, after the Korean War, his approval rating is as low as any president's ever had. Right. And Marshall stands for a toast, and he says, history will prove the greatness of this man. So we just have a couple of minutes, and I want to talk about today, but in a happy way. What does it take to be in the arena now? Would you ever encourage a friend to do what you've done, to go into public service? And if so, what does that person need to succeed, to thrive, to survive?
Well, I would say the easiest thing in the world to do is to talk somebody into running for public office who wants to run. I would actively encourage it. We're totally dependent on the people who decide to serve. And at this point, there's so many sources of information, and people think that they know more than the person they've hired to make the decision in ways they haven't before, and it makes the job harder. My wife Abby is here, and she would say that it's hard on families. Not much is off limits these days, and politics has always been rough. It was rough when Harry Truman was running for office in our state, where when he ran for re-election in 1940, the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, chose not to support him. He didn't support the other guy, the governor of Missouri, Lloyd Stark, in that primary. But the fact that he didn't support Bruce, it's always been tough. I think learning how to deal with the way we get our information now is something that the society has to do a better job of. And I think we will. I'm very optimistic about the future of America, both our economy, our relationships, the Constitution is strong, and I'd certainly be a mistake not to encourage your friends that you have confidence in to be willing to do this. You get the government you deserve. And if we're not real happy about the government right now, or in the future, or in some other time, it's because of a failure to participate in a society that demands participation.
Amen. You stole my last question, which was going to be hopeful or not. America's best days are ahead. Agree or disagree?
Agree.
I can tell you agree.
Agree.
Me too.
I think, the moment we're in, so much is going to happen in healthcare. So much is going to happen in how we compete. AI will make a bigger difference than anybody has wrapped their arms around yet. It'll probably be the first big change in society that doesn't impact, it's going to impact mid-management and upper management more than it impacts anybody else. But nobody's going to be better at it than we are. I think that's why the EU, frankly, is trying to regulate it in ways that we wouldn't regulate it, because they're not going to be as good at it as we are. Certainly, China won't be as good at it as we are. The advantage China has in this competition, whatever it is they still have a government that can totally focus on one thing, and we don't want a government that totally focuses on one thing, and we haven't had that, and we won't have that. Because we're a diverse people with diverse views of the world, and those views come together in a compromise that we call democracy.
Senator Blunt, we could go on all night, but we can't go on all night. So congratulations. Thank you for accepting the Legacy of Leadership Award and adding your star to the firmament of great public servants who have shared these evenings with us.
It's a great and largely undeserved honor for me. Thank you all. Thank you, buddy. Such a good one.